Uh, I think that for a while I'm talking to myself, it'll be incredibly boring to post updates on the portfolio, especially until I get the money deposited. And while it's just me, I think that it wouldn't hurt to do some reading and remember today as the day that I started publicly taking accountability for the actions that I'm going to take as an individual and um, display what my financial future is going to look like in real time. And when I come back and look at this, I want to have the best advice for myself in the future. And as I am full, chock full of bullshit, I think it best to take advice from someone who has made more investing mistakes than I have wise investments and take the opportunity to reread one of my favorite books that has undoubtedly returned me a lot of money and helped me pick individual stocks and uh, supremely do well for myself as an individual investor. And if I ever need to, I can come back and listen to advice from Peter Lynch in his wonderful book, One Up on Wall Street. I can hear myself say it because the line on the screen will eventually be incredibly volatile. And when that happens, uh, well, you know, Peter Lynch is famous for saying that the most important organ in investing isn't the brain, it's the stomach. So before anything happens, or before I make an unwise decision, hopefully I'll come back and rewatch this and see where I started and began showing my accountability, right? And with no further ado, One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch. I'm going to begin at the introduction. I'm going to skip about 30 pages to start with the advantages of dumb money. And I will say that if anyone cares to watch this, that when I'm reading out loud, it's bad. It just is bad. But thankfully, the words of Peter Lynch, he speaks very simply. That you can tell he understands the concept so incredibly well, because he doesn't have to use a lexicon that excludes anybody. He just tells it exactly how it is, where anyone could understand, and it is wonderful, and I appreciate that so much. Introduction: the advantages of dumb money. In bold, this is where the author, a professional investor, promises the reader that for the next 300 pages, he'll share his secrets of his success. But rule number one in my book is stop listening to professionals. 20 years in this business convinces me that any normal person using the customary 3% of the brain can pick stocks just as well, if not better, than the average Wall Street expert. I know you don't expect the plastic surgeon to advise you to do your own facelift, nor the plumber to tell you to install your own hot water tank, nor the hairdresser to recommend that you trim your own bangs. But this isn't surgery or plumbing or hairdressing. This is investing, where the smart money isn't so smart and the dumb money isn't really as dumb as it thinks it is. Dumb money is only dumb when it listens to the smart money. In fact, the amateur investor has numerous built-in advantages that, if exploited, should result in his or her outperforming of the experts, and also in the market in general. Moreover, when you pick your own stocks, you ought to outperform the experts. Otherwise, why bother? I'm not going to get carried away and advise you sell all of your mutual funds. If that started to happen on any large scale, I'd be out of a job. Besides, there's nothing wrong with mutual funds, especially the ones that are profitable to the investor. Honestly, and not immodestly, honesty and not immodesty compels me to report that millions of amateur investors have been well rewarded for investing in Fidelity Magellan, which is why I was invited to write this book in the first place. The mutual fund is a wonderful invention for people who have neither the time nor the inclination to test their wits against the stock market, as well as for people with small amounts of money to invest who seek diversification. It's when you've decided to invest on your own that you ought to try going it alone. That means ignoring the hot tips, the recommendations from your brokerage houses, and the latest can't miss suggestions from your favorite newsletter in favor of your own research. This means ignoring the stocks that you hear Peter Lynch or some similar authority is buying. There are at least 3 good reasons to ignore what Peter Lynch is buying. Number 1, he might be wrong. A long list of losers from my own portfolio consistently reminds me that the so-called smart money is exceedingly dumb about 40% of the time. Number 2, even if he is right, you'll never know when he's changed his mind about a stock and sold. And number 3, you've got better sources, and they're all around you. What makes them better is that you can keep tabs on them, just as I keep tabs on mine. If you stay half alert, you can pick the spectacular performers right from your place of business or out of the neighborhood shopping mall, and long before Wall Street discovers them. It's impossible to be a credit card carrying American consumer without having done a lot of the fundamental analysis on dozens of companies. And if you work in the industry, so much the better. This is where you'll find the 10 baggers. I've seen it happen again and again from my perch at Fidelity. Section, those wonderful 10 baggers. In Wall Street parlance, I wish I was better read. In Wall Street parlance, there's no N, there's no second N. I'm so sorry. In Wall Street parlance, a 10 bagger is a stock in which you've made 10 times your money. I suspect this highly technical term has been borrowed from baseball, which only goes up to a 4 bagger, or a home run. In my business, a 4 bagger is nice, but a 10 bagger is where the fiscal equivalent of 2 home runs. But a 10 bagger is the fiscal equivalent of 2 home runs and a double. If you've ever had a 10 bagger in the stock market, you know how appealing it can be. I developed a passion for making 10 times my money early in my investing career. The first stock I ever bought, Flying Tiger Airlines, turned out to be a multi-bagger that put me through graduate school. In the last decade, the occasional 5 and 10 bagger and the rare 20 bagger has helped my fund outgain the competition, and I own 1,400 stocks. In a small portfolio, even one of these remarkable performers can transform a loss into a profitable one. It's amazing how this works. The effect is most striking in weak stock markets. Yes, there are 10 baggers in weak stock markets. Let's go back to 1980, 2 years before the dawn of the great bull market. Suppose you invested $10,000 in the following 10 stocks on December 22nd, 1980, and held them until October 1983. That's strategy A. Strategy B is the same, except you added an 11th Stop and Shop, which turned out to be a 10 bagger. The result from strategy A is that your $10,000 would have increased to $13,040 for a mediocre 30.4% return. Over the nearly 3 years, the S&P offered a total return of 40.6% in the same period. You'd have a perfect right to look at your portfolio and say, "Big deal. Why don't I leave the investing to the pros?" But if you added Stop and Shop, your $10,000 would have more than doubled to $21,600, giving you a total return of 110% and a chance to brag on Wall Street. Furthermore, if you had added to your position in Stop and Shop as you saw the company's prospects improving, your overall return might have been twice as high. To make this spectacular showing, you only had to find one big winner out of 11. The more right you are about any one stock, the more wrong you can be about all the others and still triumph as an investor. Apples and Donuts subsection. You may have thought that a 10-bagger can only happen with some wild penny stock in some weird company, like Briano Biofeedback or Cosmic R&D, the kind of stock that sensible investors avoid. Actually, there are numerous 10-baggers in companies that you'll recognize: Dunkin' Donuts, Walmart, Toys R Us, Stop and Shop, and Subaru, just to mention a few. These companies whose products you've admired and enjoyed, but who would have suspected, oh, I am so sorry, that if you bought the Subaru stock along with the Subaru car, you'd be a millionaire today? I just misread it. I'm not going to go back. Yet it's true. This serendipitous calculation is based on several assumptions. First, that you bought the stock at its low of $2 a share in 1977. Second, that you sold at the high of 1986, which would have amounted to $312 a share, unadjusted for the 8-to-1 split. That is a 156 bagger and the fiscal equivalent of 39 home runs. So if you invested $6,410 in the stock, certainly in the price range of a car, you'd come out with $1 million exactly. Instead of owning a battered trade-in, you'd have just enough money to be able to afford a mansion and a couple of Jaguars in the garage. You would have been unlikely to make $1 million by investing as much in Dunkin' Donuts stock as you spent on the donuts. How many donuts can a person eat? But if along with the 2 dozen donuts you bought every week for a year in 1982, a $270 total outlay, you had invested equal amount in shares, then 4 years later, shares would have been worth $1,539. That's 6 times your money. A $10,000 investment in Dunkin' Donuts would have resulted in $47,000 in gains over 4 years. If in 1976 you'd have bought 10 pairs of jeans at the Gap for $180, the jeans would have been worn out by now. But 10 shares of Gap stock purchased at the same time for $180, $18 a share was the IPO price, was worth $4,672.50 at the market high in 1987. A $10,000 investment in the Gap would have resulted in a $250,000 gain. If, during 1973, you had spent 31 nights on business trips at La Quinta Motor Inns, paying $11 and 98 cents per night for the room, and you matched the $371 room bill with an equivalent purchase of La Quinta stock, 23.21 shares, your shares would have been worth $4,363. 10 years later, a $10,000 investment in La Quinta Inn would have resulted in a $100,000-ish gain. If, during 1969, you found yourself having to pay for a traditional burial, $986, of a loved one from whom one of the many funeral outlets owned by Service Corporation International and somehow, in spite of your grief, you managed to invest another $980 in SCI stock, your 70 shares would have been worth $14,000 in 1987. A $10,000 investment in SCI would have resulted in a $137,000 gain. If, back in 1982, during the same week you bought that first $2,000 Apple computer so your children could improve their grades and get into college, you'd put another $2,000 into Apple stock, then by 1987 those Apple shares were worth $11,950, or enough to pay for another year at college. Subsection: The power of common knowledge. To get these spectacular returns, you had to buy and sell exactly at the right time. But even if you missed the highs or the lows, you would have done better to have invested in any of the familiar companies mentioned above than in some of the esoteric enterprises that neither of us understands. There's a famous story about a fireman from New England. Apparently, back in the 1950s, he couldn't help noticing that a local Tambrins plant, then the company was called Tampax, was expanding at a furious pace. It occurred to him that they wouldn't be expanding so fast unless they were prospering, and on that assumption, he and his family invested $2,000. Not only that, they put in another $2,000 each year for the next 5 years. By 1972, the fireman was a millionaire, and he hadn't even bought any Subaru. Whether or not you are a fortunate investor asked any brokers or experts for advice, I'm not certain, but many would have told him his theory was flawed, and if he knew it was good for him, he'd stick with the blue chips the institutions were buying, or with the hot electronics issues that were popular at the time. Luckily, the fireman kept his own counsel. You might not you might have assumed it's the sophisticated and high-level gossip that experts hear around the Quotron machines that gives us our best investment ideas. But I get many of mine from the way the fireman got his. I talk to hundreds of companies a year and spend hour after hour in heady powwows with CEOs, financial analysts, and my colleagues in the mutual fund business. But I stumble into the big winners in extracurricular situations, the same way you could. Taco Bell. I was impressed with the burrito on a trip to California. La Quinta Motor Inns. Somebody at the rival Holiday Inn told me about it. Volvo. My family and friends drive this car. Apple Computer. My kids had one at home, and then the systems manager bought several for the office. Service Corporation International. A Fidelity Electronics analyst who had nothing to do with funeral homes, so this wasn't his field. Found on a trip to Texas. Dunkin' Donuts. I love the coffee. And recently, the revamped Pure One imports, recommended by my wife. In fact, Carolyn is one of my best sources. She's the one who discovered Legs. Legs is the perfect example of the power of common knowledge. It turned out to be one of the two most successful consumer products of the 70s. In the early part of that decade, before I took over to Fidelity Magellan, I was working as a securities analyst at the firm. I knew the textile business from having traveled to the country visiting textile plants, calculating profit margins, price to earnings ratios, and the esoterica of wraps and woofs. But none of this information was as valuable as Carolyn's. I didn't find Legs in my research. She found it by going to the grocery store. Right there, in a freestanding metal rack near the checkout counter, was a new display of women's pantyhose, packaged in colorful plastic eggs. The company, Hanes, was test marketing Legs at several sites around the country, including suburban Boston. When Hanes interviewed hundreds of women leaving the test supermarkets and asked them if they just bought pantyhose, a high percentage answered yes, yet most of them couldn't recall the name of the brand. Hanes was ecstatic. If a product becomes a bestseller without brand name recognition, imagine how it will sell once the brand is publicized. Carolyn didn't need to be a textile analyst to realize that Legs was a superior product. All she had to do was buy a pair and try them on. These stockings had what they call a heavier, I've never seen this word, a heavier denier, which made them less likely to develop a run than normal stockings. They also fit very well, but the main attraction was convenience. You could pick up legs right next to the bubble gum and the razor blades, and without having to make a special trip to the department store. Hanes already sold its regular brand of stockings in the department stores and the specialty stores. However, the company had determined that women customarily visit one or the other every 6 weeks on average, whereas they go to the grocery store twice a week, which gives them 12 chances to buy legs for every one chance to buy the regular brand. Selling stockings in the grocery store was an immensely popular idea. You could have figured that out by seeing the numbers of women with plastic eggs in their grocery carts at the checkout counter. You could just imagine how many legs were going to be sold nationwide after the word got out. How many women who bought pantyhose, store clerks who saw the woman buying pantyhose, and the husbands who saw the woman coming home with pantyhose knew about the success of legs? Millions. 2 or 3 years after the product was introduced, you could have walked into any one of thousands of supermarkets and realized that this was a bestseller. From there, it was easy enough to find out that Legs was made by Hanes and that Hanes was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Once Carolyn alerted me to Hanes, I did the customary research into the story. The story was even better than I'd thought. So with the same confidence as the fireman who bought Tam brands, I recommended the stock to Fidelity's portfolio managers. Hanes turned out to be a six-bagger before it was taken over by Consolidated Foods, now Sara Lee. Legs still makes a lot of money for Sara Lee and has grown consistently over the past decade. I am convinced Hanes would have been a 50-bagger if it hadn't been bought out. The beauty of Legs is that you didn't have to know about it from the outset. You could have bought Hanes stock the first year, the second year, or even the third year after Legs went nationwide, and you would have tripled your money at least. But a lot of people didn't, especially husbands. Husbands, usually known as the designated investors, probably were too busy buying solar energy stocks or satellite dish company stocks and losing their collective shirts. Consider my friend Harry Houndstooth, whose name I've changed to protect the unfortunate. Actually, there's a little bit of houndstooth in all of us. The designated investor, each family seems to have one, has just spent the morning reading the Wall Street Journal, plus a $250 a year stock market newspaper to which he subscribes. He's looking for another exciting stock play, something with limited risk, but big potential to the upside. In both the journal and his newsletter, there's a favorable mention of Winchester Disk Drives, a headstrong little firm with a dandy future. Houndstooth doesn't know a disk drive from a clay pigeon, but he calls his broker and learns that Merrill Lynch has put Winchester on his aggressive buy list. All this can't be pure coincidence, thinks Houndstooth. He's soon convinced that putting $3,000 of his hard-earned money into Winchester is a very clever idea. After all, he's done the research. Houndstooth's wife, Henrietta, also known as the person who doesn't understand the serious business of money, these roles could be reversed but usually aren't, has just returned from the shopping mall where she's discovered these wonderful new women's apparel store a wonderful new women's apparel store called The Limited. The place is mobbed with customers. She can't wait to tell her husband about the friendly salespeople and the terrific bargains. I bought Jennifer's entire fall wardrobe, she exclaims. Only $275. $275, grouses the designated investor. While you've been out squandering money, I've been at home figuring out how to make it. Winchester disk drives is the answer. As near a sure thing as you could get. We're putting $3,000 into it. I hope you know what you're doing, says the person who doesn't understand the serious business of money. Remember, have a light photo cell? That sure went from $7 to $3.50. We lost $1,500. Yeah, but that was Havalite. This is Winchester. The Wall Street Journal calls disk drives one of the major growth industries of this decade. Why should we be the only ones not to get in on it? The rest of the story is easy to imagine. Winchester Disk Drives has a bad quarter, or there's an unexpected competition in the disk drive industry, and the stock price drops from $10 to $5. Since the designated investor, has no possible way to understand what any of this means, he decides the prudent thing to do is sell out, delighted that he only lost another $1,500, or a little more than 5 sets of Jennifer's wardrobes. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Houndstooth, the stock price of the Limited, the store that impressed his wife, Henrietta, has been moving steadily higher from less than 50 cents a share, adjusted for splits, in December 1979 to $9 in 1983, already a 20-bagger to there. And even if he'd bought it at the $9 price and suffered through one drop back to $5, he'd have made more than 5 times his money as the stock soared to 52 and 7/8. That's over 100-bagger from the beginning. So if Houndstooth had invested $10,000 early enough, he would have made over $1,000,000 in the stock. More realistically, if Miss Houndstooth had matched the $275 she put into the wardrobe with another $275 in the stock, it's conceivable that even her tiny investment would have paid for a semester's tuition for her daughter. But our designated investor, who had plenty of time to buy into the Limited, even after he sold out on Winchester, continued to ignore the great spousal tip. By then, there were 400 limited shares in the country. There were 400 limited stores in the country, and most of them crowded, but Houndstooth was too busy to notice. He was following what Boone Pickens was doing with the Mesa Petroleum. Sometime near the end of 1987, and probably just before the 508-point jiggle, Houndstooth discovers that the Limited is on his brokerage firm's buy list. Furthermore, there have been promising articles in 3 different magazines. The stock has become a darling of the big institutions, and there are 30 analysts on the trail. It occurs to the designated investor that this is a solid, respectable buy. Funny thing, he mutters to his wife one day. Remember that store you like, the Limited? Turns out to be a public company. That means we can buy the stock. Pretty good stock to boot, judging by the special I just saw on PBS. I heard on Forbes that they even had a cover story on it. Anyway, the smart money can't get enough of it. Gotta be worth at least a couple thousand from the retirement fund. We still got a couple thousand in the retirement fund? Asked the skeptical Henrietta. Of course we do, blusters the designated investor, and it'll soon be more, thanks to your favorite store. But I don't shop at the Limited anymore, Henrietta says. The merchandise is overpriced and no longer unique. Other stores carry the same thing now. What's that got to do with anything, bellows our designated investor. I'm not talking about shopping, I'm talking about investing. Houndstooth buys the stock at $50, near the all-time high in 1987. Soon, the price begins to fall to $16, and about halfway down, he sells out, delighted once again to have limited his losses. I love that story. It's a good story. We like those. Subsection. Is this a public company? I'm a fine one to chide on Houndstooth for missing the Limited. I didn't buy any shares on the way up either, and my wife saw the same crowds at the shopping mall as his wife did. I, too, bought the Limited when the store got popular and the fundamentals had begun to deteriorate, and I'm still holding on at a loss. Actually, I could go on for several more pages about the 10 baggers I've missed, and more sorry examples will crop up further along in the book. When it comes to ignoring promising opportunities, I'm as adept as the next person. Once I was standing on the greatest asset play of the century, the Pebble Beach golf course, and it never occurred to me to ask if it was a public company. I was too busy asking about the distance between the tees and the greens. Luckily, there are enough 10-baggers around so that both of us could fail to notice the majority, and we'll still hit our share. In a large portfolio such as mine, I have to hit several before it makes an appreciable difference. In a small portfolio, such as yours, you only have to hit one. Moreover, the nice thing about investing in familiar companies such as L'Eggs or Dunkin' Donuts is that when you try on the stockings or sip the coffee, you're already doing the kind of fundamental analysis that they pay Wall Street analysts to do. Visiting stores and testing products is one of the critical elements of an analyst's job. During a lifetime of buying cars or cameras, you develop a sense of what's good and what's bad, that what sells and what doesn't. If it's not cars you know something about, you could know something about something else. And the most important part is, You know it before Wall Street knows it. Why wait for the Merrill Lynch restaurant expert to recommend Dunkin' Donuts when you've already seen 8 new franchises opening up in your area? The Merrill Lynch restaurant analyst isn't going to notice Dunkin' Donuts, for a reason I'll explain soon, until the stock has quintupled from $2 to $10, and you noticed it when the stock was $2. Subsection Ginning the oh wait Giggling the gigahertz. That's wonderful. I love that to death. I'm actually going to stop at this subsection here, and we'll pick up at giggling the gigahertz, and we can know more about wonderful opportunities at a different time. Um, have a good night.